This is a special presentation brought to you by the Daf Map, based on one of the lectures given by HaRav Yehonasan Berger Shlita. Please check out our other videos and shiurim at www.thedafmap.com.
Today's shiur begins 9 lines from the top. We continue with a quote from the Mishnah. We had seen a long list of items concerning which the Nazir, if he is defiled to them, will have to stop his Nazirus. He loses the days that he counted and has to observe a purification period and restart the Nazirus later. Hashedra v'hagugolas. Before we continue further into the Gemara, though, let us glance at the side where we have a topic heading, birur, an analysis or a clarification. Ha dikotoni, that which it was taught in the Mishnah Daf Mem Testament Beis, al hashedra ve'al hagulgolas. The shedra is the spine, gulgolas the skull. How are we to understand the Mishnah? Shedra ve'gulgolas, is it when the two are present together? O shedra o gulgolas, the chol echad levad must speak. Or spine or skull. Either one is enough to cause the Nazir to lose the Nazirus days that he had counted thus far. The Gemara will present those two sides of the question, and then you'll notice if you scan ahead, and we, with Gemara markings, always recommend to get a bird's eye view, scan ahead and see what direction the Gemara is going to take. And here we have basically a one-topic discussion till practically the end of today's shiur. I say practically, there will continue further another discussion toward the end, but notice the triangles, and notice that they appear in different directions. So on the side, under our mivneh, the triangle with the point facing up, hochachos o shedra o gugos, these will be attempts to show one or the other is sufficient. When the inverted triangle appears, you'll see in number 3, you have one of those, and also number 5. These are attempts to show shedra v'gulgoles, that the Nazirus, the stira, the cancellation of the Nazirus is only if you have both. So we have a mixed bag of proofs. Now the Gemara, Ibaya Laho. Shedra v'gulgoles tanan, the Mishnah, when it speaks of the Nazir losing out his days, is it with if he is in the presence, if he's in the same room as a spine and a skull? Tanan, is that what's taught? O dilma o shedra o gulgoles. One or the other is sufficient. Omar Rava Tashma. So let's try to conclude from the following quote. Shedra shegired rov il'in sheba Torah. A spine where the majority of the ribs, il'in are the ribs, have been shaved off or cut off. Tahora. Such a spine does not communicate defilement. Ubekever afilu mishuberes o mefurekes temea mipnei hakever. My understanding of the case of the kever is you have a spine with the ribs cut off, but they're all together in the grave. So in a case like that, even though the spine had the ribs removed from it, but in the grave, they're viewed as all together. Now, what are we supposed to derive from this source? The Gemara continues, Taima mishum degirei. The spine, in this case, does not communicate defilement, is because the ribs were removed. Ha lo girei, if the ribs were not shaved off, tomei, it would have communicated the tumah, even though there was no skull. Shma mina. So from this halachic, or from this Tanaic source, from Oilus, from Maseches Oilus, we can derive O shedra O gulgoles kotani, that when you see mention of these bones, you can understand it's either a spine or a skull. That is derived from the fact that the tahara described here is because the spine's ribs were removed. Had the spine's ribs not been removed, it would have communicated defilement, even though there is no skull. Gemara rejects this. The basis of our proof was the inference we drew from it, and we underlined the line before the word ha lo gireid. But the Gemara, in rejecting the conclusion, is saying ha lo kotani. The inference information is not stated in the source. Therefore, what the source informs us is basically at face value ha komash malon. What the source teaches us is the chigire Torah, that if ribs are removed, so it will not communicate tuma. Idoch, the other information, namely what about a spine alone that did not have the ribs removed, that tiboyach, that remains a question. Let's take a look together at Tosfos, where we have a double star. You'll notice the second to last narrow line of the Tosfos commentary. Umeshani mikotoni ha lo girei tamea. The Gemara's response or rejection was by saying, does it say in the source that if the ribs were not removed, it would communicate tuma? It doesn't say that. Hokomash malon, what the source does tell us is the chigired tahora v'idach tibayalach, that if the ribs were shaved off, then it does not communicate tuma. The other information is still a question. Pirush mikotoni, and now Tosfos explains what we read in the Gemara. Mikotoni halo girei tamea below gugulas. Does it say in the source that if the ribs were not removed, the spine would communicate tuma without the skull? Dilma kishiyesh ima gilgulis iri. Maybe what the source is speaking about is a situation where you have a spine with a skull, v'afal pikain, and even though both are present, ki girei rov tzloi sheba tahora. If the majority of the ribs were removed from the spine, it would not communicate tuma. V'idach tiboyloch, klomar below gireid, v'ein sham elo hashedra below gulgos tiboyloch. As far as a spine with the ribs in place, without a skull there, that remains something to question, to ask about. We turn back to the Gemara, attempt number 2, Tashma. We're again trying to figure out the Mishnah when it speaks about spine, skull. Is it spine or skull, or only when spine and skull are there will the Nazir have to megalech? Tashma Rav Yehuda Omer Shisha Dvarim. There are 6 points. The 6 points are featured later on the page, so we'll just leave it right now that there's 6 points. Rabbi Kiva mitame v'chachomim mitarin v'chozar bo Rabbi Kiva. Rabbi Kiva initially said that regarding the 6 points that there is defilement, and the Chomim said there is not, and Rabbi Kiva reversed his position. Umaisa sheviu kupa maleo atzomos lebeis hakneses shel tarsayim. There was on one occasion a box full of bones was brought to the shul of the Tarsayim. Tarsayim are people that work with copper. Sorfei nechoshes, they are, maybe we'll call them coppersmiths. Vehinichua ba'avir, and the box was placed outdoors without any overshadowing, so that people who chanced by the box would not be under the same overshadowing. And in this way avoid defilement. The doctors that were there, the name of one of them is Todos. He was a rofe, a doctor, and all the other doctors with him. And they inspected the box, and they said, Ein kan shedra mimeis echad. There may be a lot of bones in the box, but you don't have a spine from one corpse. Taimo doleko shedra lemechado. The reason that they concluded that the bones don't represent a problem is because you don't have a spine from one body. Hoika o shedra ogugolos demechado. Had there been a spine or a body, or a skull, that is, a spine or a skull from one corpse, Nazir megaleach oleha. The Nazir would have had to lose out, cancel his Nazirus, and observe the Tumah purification days, resulting in a haircut. Shma mina. So from this we can conclude Oi Shedra, Oi Gulgoles Tanan. So from the reaction and the inference that we drew from the reaction of Todos and his colleagues, we conclude that if there had been either a spine or a skull from one deceased, then a Nazir would have had to megalech. The Gemara rejects this. Lo mibaya ka'omar. The source is taught in the lo mibaya sense. What does that mean? So let's read on. Lo mibaya shedra v'gulgolis demimes echad leka. It goes without saying that in this particular story there wasn't a spine and skull from one corpse. Elo afilu oy shedra mimes echad oy gulgoles mimes echad leka. There isn't even a spine or a skull from one body. So that this source is not conclusive. All that we see in this source is that they were exclaiming, there is no reason to even think that the Nazir would have to be megaleach. That, namely, there isn't a spine and a skull, which at this point we can say that's what a Nazir would have been megaleach. Namely, you really need to have both. But you don't have even that. You don't even have a spine alone or a skull alone from one body, which, even if you did, a Nazir wouldn't necessarily megaleach over that. So, as we have seen till now, we have a source, we have sources leading in one direction, but we reject it, leading us in the other direction. We continue. Tashma miminyona. Let us come to a conclusion based on a list with a number to it. The numbers are important here. We made reference before to a controversy between Rabbi Akiva and the sages concerning 6 matters, and it was pointed out that eventually Rabbi Akiva changed his mind. What were those 6 things? Toshma minyana, we'll bring a proof, as we said, from the numbers. Mahain shisha devorim Rabbi Akiva mitame v'chachomim mitarin. What were those 6 points of controversy that Rabbi Akiva declares defilement and the Chomim say no? And let's go through the items. Notice we have numbered them. The numbers here are important for the Gemara later on. So, number 1, al aver min hameis sheba mishnei mesim. A limb from a corpse, but in fact the one limb is made up of 2 parts coming from 2 different bodies. So you have part of a limb from corpse 1, the other part of that limb from corpse 2, creating a complete limb, but from 2 bodies. Number 2, we're talking here about a limb from amputees. So it's one limb coming from 2 different people. Vial chatzi kav atzamos sheba mishnei mesim. A half a kav. A kav is a measure, a dry measure. So here we have a half kav of bones that come from 2 different skeletons. Vial revius dam haba mishnayim. Revius is a liquid measure. A revius halug, a revius of blood coming from 2 corpses. Number 5, al etzem kisoros shenechlak lishnayim. A bone the size of a barley grain, but it's not complete, it's split. So you have a total barley grain of bone, but it's nechlak, it's split lishnayim to 2 parts. And number 6, v'hashedra v'hagugolis. Now, in order to account for 6 items, you can see we have to count shedra and gugolis together. The Gemara continues at the top of Amud Beis. If Tuma is generated by one or the other, and Hani Shiva Hafion, then you would have to say there's 7, and the list explicitly says 6. The Gemara now rejects that conclusion, and you'll notice we have a marking scheme, a double underline, and these we can call, we have under our Mivneh heading, we call this a Sidra Shel Dechios, a series of rejections of what we thought we could conclude. So you have here 4 different ways of let's say disregarding the conclusion, or of explaining the 6. Remember, we have to keep the number 6, and at the same time be able to say it's Shedra O Kugolas, one or the other, and maintain 6 and not have to say 7. The part of we'll say the trick in this Gemara is that one of the other items in the list we will delete. And why? So then we'll see that as we go on in the Gemara. So the Gemara continues. Ki katani, and here we have to work with the underlying response, is that in general we are to understand one or the other, Shedra or Gugoles. And as far as the source, Ki katani, kol hecha de pligi ole rabim, where you have items that, what items belong in the list? Items that Rabbi Akiva was challenged by Rabbim, by a multitude, by more than a single adversary. Lafuke etzem kisura, with the exception of that case. And what number was etzem kisura in the list? It was number 5. So what we're going to tell you now is take out number 5 from the list. Take out the etzem kisura. Why are we deleting that? The Yachidhu de Poligole. We find that it's only a single opinion that argues, not a multitude of opinions, but a single opinion, multitude of rabbis, but rather a single rabbi argues with Rabbi Akiva. The Sanya, as you can see that in the following source, Etzem Kisor Shnechalak L'Shtayim Rabbi Akiva Metame, the barley grain sized bone that's got split into 2, Rabbi Akiva says communicates defilement, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri metahir. And here he's a single individual, and he declares it tohar. So it doesn't belong in the list. The list contains 6 items that a multitude of rabbis challenge Rabbi Akiva. Not so in the case of Etzem Kisora. So what did we do? We took out Etzem Kisora from the list, and thereby are enabled to count Shedra by itself and Gogoles, Go, by itself. And I'll arrive at 6 points of controversy. V'iboyasema, another approach, Ki Kotani, Ever Min Hames. This list was interested in dealing with appendages, limbs from the dead. Ever Minachai Lo Kotani. The amputee case, namely case number 2, should not be included, because that is a situation where the person is still alive and it's just his limb was removed. Another approach to explain the list, Kol Hecha de Nazir Megalecha Hilo. This list is talking not just about defilement, but it's the kind of defilement that would result in a Nazir losing out his Nazirus days, though any days that he had counted till that point. La'afuki etzem kisora dolo, to the exclusion of, once again, number 5. It's true that etzem kisora communicates tumas mace. A person will become defiled if he touches or carries an etzem kisora, a bone the size of a barley grain, but a Nazir will not lose out the days that he had counted if he encounters the etzem kisora. Therefore, it doesn't belong in the list. The list was interested in counting only those things that would force a Nazir to restart his Nazirus. Number 4, the list has points, or the list is supposed to contain points concerning which Rabbi Akiva eventually reversed his original position. Lafuki revias dam de lo hodarbe. Example 4 in the list dealt with a revius. We said before that's a liquid measure of blood that comes from a corpse, concerning which we don't find Rabbi Akiva reversing his position. The Omar lay Rebbe lebar kapora. Rebbe instructed Bar Kapora. Bar Kapora was responsible for the authorship of brises. He dealt with, we'll say, editing Tanaic literature. And Rebbe, who was the famous editor of the Mishnayos, he says to Bar Kapora, Lo tishne revius dam bechazora. Don't teach the case of revius dam as one of the items that Rabbi Akiva reversed his position on. Rabbi Akiva has a tradition concerning the revius of dam. And in the list we have to add the main point. It was revius dam haba mishnaim. It's one revius that came from two separate corpses. A half a revius from one corpse and a half a revius from another corpse. So you have one revius from two bodies. Concerning that, Rabbi Akiva did not reverse his position. Furthermore, he has a pasuk that supports his position on that matter, and which says, "Ve'al kol nafshos meis lo yavo." In this pasuk, you have the word nafshos. It's in the plural. Nafshos meaning people. In this case, it's really the blood from two people. One shall not enter into a room where you have that. So that's Rabbi Akiva's position. He didn't reverse himself on that. Therefore, number 4 doesn't belong in a list of items concerning which Rabbi Akiva reversed his position. Rabbi Shimon Omer. Here we have, it's almost parenthetical, but since we are speaking about Rabbi Akiva and his change of position, we have a quote here. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Ad Yomov Hoya Metame. That means, throughout his life, Rabbi Akiva did not change his position. If at the time he died, meaning like in his last day, did he back out? Eini Yodea, I don't know. Now, here we have a remarkable illustration of refinement of speech. We're dealing here with something that I would say is a very delicate, a very sensitive item in choice of words. Rabbi Shimon, he happened to have been a student of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Shimon is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. He was one of the 5 major students that Rabbi Akiva taught after Rabbi Akiva lost 24,000 students in the days between Pesach and Shavuos. Rabbi Shimon, speaking about Rabbi Akiva, says, listen, during his lifetime, I don't know if he backed out. If at the time he died, and he uses the word mishames, Tana, the Gemara says that we have a source that says, Hushcharu Shinov Mipnei Tani Yosef. Rabbi Shimon observed many, many fast days because his teeth went black because of his many, many fast days that he observed. Why? Because of the way he spoke about his Rebbe. He said, as we said, well, when he died, I don't know if he changed his mind. The Tosfos says, it's not etiquette to speak about your Rebbe in that fashion. And he, as a result, in order to achieve atonement for his lack of, let's say, best choice of words, so he observed fast days, which led to his teeth turning black. The Rashi says, "Mibnei Tani Yosef lefisha derech ginai hoy mishtoyle de Rabbi Akiva Omar imishameis chozar bo." That's a derech. It's denigrating to speak about your rabbi in that fashion. The Gemara continues. Toshma, the Sanya. Once again, we're trying to figure out the Mishnah that speaks about a Nazir having to megaleach, to lose the Nazir's days that he counted and observe a purification period for defilement. Is our Mishnah to be understood spine together with skull, or even spine alone or skull alone would be able to have that effect on the Nazir. And as we say, we're at number 4, and we have a triangle with the point facing up. So the initial thrust of this is to show one or the other. Toshma desanya beishamai oimrim roiva atzamos minhu atzomim o mishnayim o mishlosha. In order for rova atzomos to metame ba'oil, to communicate tuma through overshadowing, you'd have to have a rova. That's a quantity of bones coming from 2 or 3 different bones, not one bone. Ubeisil omrim rova min hagvia. The rova comes from the gvia, from the body. And what do we mean by that? It's meirov binyan oy meirov haminyan. Either from most of the height of the individual. In other words, the rova of bones would be from 2 thigh bones and 1 lower leg bone, or 2 lower leg bones and 1 thigh bone, or meirov haminyan. Rov haminyan, we work with the assumption that there are 248 bones in a body, and rov of that would be 125. So that if you have a rova that comes from 125 bones, so you might have bone fragments from 125 different bones, but they add up to a rova that will be metama ba'oil, and communicate death defilement through overshadowing. Amar Rabbi Yoshua, Yocholi lasos divrei Beis Shammai v'divrei Beis Hillel ke'echad. I could actually make it such that Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel aren't even arguing with one another. Beis Shammai didn't speak about any measures. He spoke about, let me retract. He spoke about a rova of bones, and he mentioned coming from 2 or 3 bones. That, in fact, could be in agreement with Beis Hillel. Let's explain. Beis Shammai said a rova, that quantity of bones from 2 or 3 bones, that's o mishnei shokayim v'yarech echad. Shokayim, the shoka is the lower leg bone between the knee and the ankle. So you have 2 of those and 1 thigh bone. O mishnei yerechayim v'shok echad, or 2 thigh bones and 1 of the shok bones. And why are they significant? That is the majority of the height of an adult, of a large person. And that's what Beis Hillel spoke about himself. He mentioned Rov Binyono. Beis Hillel Omer min hagvia, oy mi Rov Binyono mi Rov Minyan. The bones that constitute a body, meaning either the majority of the person's height, which is, as we said before, accounted for by 2 thigh bones and 1 shok bone, or vice versa, oy meirov minyan, or bones that come from bone fragments from a majority of the bones. Hoyol v'yeshnon b'mifrukei yadayim v'raglayim. You will find many, many bones from the different joints that make up the hands and the feet of a person. Shammai Omer, and truth be told, up to this point, we didn't really have to focus on any one point. But now we really have to focus. Shammai Omer, afilu etzem min hashedra oy min hagulgoyles. Even 1 bone from a spine or from a skull. Now, that's Shammai's opinion. Now, the thinking is, what about the Rabbanan who would disagree with Shammai? So they're not going to go as far as saying 1 bone from a spine. But they would say an entire spine or an entire skull. Well, if we were to stop here, then we would have an answer to our question, namely, O Shedra, Oy, Gulgolis, one or the other. The Gemara says, you can't conclude anything from Shammai's position. Shiny Shammai, the Machmir. Shammai is different. He's extremely stringent. He's very Machmir. And as far as the Rabbanan are concerned, they would require both a spine and a skull in order to establish Tumah, and hence that would be the conclusion for the Mishnah. Well, alright, if you want to say that Shammai is different, he's extremely Machmir, and the Rabbanan really require both, well then, Lifshot Minah, let us then use that as a method of coming to a conclusion. Taimo de Shammai de Machmir. Shammai speaks about one bone from a spine or one skull bone. That is enough to communicate the defilement, because he's very stringent. HaRabbanan, but the Rabbanan adiko shedra v'gulgolis. The Rabbanan would say that you really need to have both. So then let us use this as our conclusion, that you need to have both. No, you can't conclude that either. Ad kan lo pligi Rabbanan olei de Shammai elo be'etzem echad osi min hashedra umin hagulgolis. Up till this point, all we know is that the Rabbanan disagree with Shammai, who spoke about the defilement through a single bone, like a single vertebrae from a spine, or a single bone from a skull. Afilu chad minhon. However, if you have an entire spine or an entire skull, as far as the Rabbanan are concerned, that might in fact be enough. And you won't say you need to have both. So, as you can see, a sugya that you find the likes of which many places throughout the Shas, attempts in one direction and rejections showing you the other direction. Before we continue further, let us glance at the side where we have a nosei, a topic heading, the nosei. She'elas Rami Bar Chama. Hayim Nazir Yigaleach al Rova Atzamos Shebo Min Hashedra V'Hagulgoles. Will a Nazir have to lose his Nazirus? We use the term Yigaleach, and we've been using that for the last few dapim as a catchphrase for a Nazir losing out the days of Nazirus that he observed up till this point of, we'll say, potential defilement. So our question is, a Nazir, will he lose his Nazirus days for being in the same room as a Rova Atzamos? A Rova is that measure we've mentioned before of bones. Shebo min hashedra v'gugoles me'achar sheim chashuvim ulai yesh lahachmir dafilu al Rova v'lo rak al chatzi kav kidikotoni b'shar Atzamos. We have learned in the past, a Nazir will lose his Nazirus days with regard to tumas, oil, and bones only if you have a half kav, not a quarter kav, a rova, quarter kav. So the bone rule is a half kav causes Nazir to lose out. Quarter kav would not cause a Nazir to lose out. But what if the quarter kav happens to be bones that come from the spine or the skull? We also have on the side a mivneh note, a structural note. A trapezoid or volcano shape will appear, and you'll notice it appears in alternating directions or various directions. The narrow part facing upwards is a nisayon lahifiach de'ein rova mishadra v'gegelis metamin boil. It's an attempt to show that a rova coming from these unique bones will not be sufficient. And the inverted shape will show a nisayon, an attempt lochiach sheyesh lahachmir berova mishadra, that we should be stringent, that even this lesser quantity, a rova as opposed to a chatzi kav, is sufficient if it's a rova from a spine. The Gemara. Boi Romi Bachama. Rova atzamos min hashedra v'gugoles mai. and we emphasize a rova as a quarter kav, not a half kav as applies to other bones, but a quarter kav min hashedra v'gugoles that come from a spine, a skull. What will the result of that be if a Nazir, in the middle of his Nazirus, enters a room where you have a rova atzamos from a shedra? Ki kotoni chatzi kav atzamos hechodiko misharei vorov. The Mishnah that teaches that a Nazir is megaleach over a chatzi kav, a half kav of bones, that's when the bones come from the other limbs. Avol min shedra v'gugoles dechamiri. But when it comes to a spine or skull, which we know have uniqueness and significance in and of themselves, afilu rova atzamos, it could be that even a rova of bones that come from a spine or a skull will be enough, will be strict enough or stringent enough to force the Nazir to start all over again. Or maybe we don't make any distinction, and just like all other bones, a Nazir doesn't lose his Nazirus unless there's a half kav of them. So too, if you have bones from a spine or a skull, you'd have to have a half kav of them as well. Omar Rava Tashma. So let's try to prove from the Mishnah itself. It said Hashedra v'hagugoles. Now there's an assumption right now that you don't have a shedra less than a rova. A shedra, again, is a spine. That there's no spine that's less than a rova, a kav. V'i salka daitach rova atzomos de'osi min shedra v'gugoles tomei. If a rova of bones from a spine or a skull would communicate defilement, Listening, the Mishnah should have taught Al Rova Atzamos Habo Min Hashedra. The Mishnah didn't say that. The Mishnah spoke about a complete Shedra, but it didn't say pieces of Shedra that amount to a Rova. So from the fact that it doesn't teach thusly, if you're dealing then with pieces of spine that are accumulated or collected together, you would have to have a chatzi kav of them, and only then would a Nazir megaleach. We continue at the top of Daf Nun Gimel. The Gemara asks, and here we have to emphasize that the one who introduced this discussion was Rava. So the Gemara asks, "HaRav hu di Amar," but Rava himself has said, "Lo nitzrecha elo l'shedra v'gulgelas she'ein bohen rova atzamos." This was part of a discussion that we saw earlier. Rashi quotes Daf Nun, and we can look at the Rashi together at the top. V'ha Rava hu di Amar liel ha dikotoni al hames. We had a problem a few dapim ago where we saw the Mishnah lists off items and says al hames ve'al kezayis min hames. And we wanted to know, what is the purpose of teaching al hames? If for a mere olive quantity of corpse flesh, a Nazir will have to megaleach, so concerning a full mace, all the more so. So is it not redundant? And regarding that, Rava explained that the term al hames lo nitzrocha lo l'rov binyono o l'rov minyono afapi she'ein bohen rov atzamos v'afapi she'ein olav bosar she'anozir megalech olav. The Mishnah was referring to a collection of bones where you might have rov binyan, rov of the height, or rov of the number of bones, even though they don't amount to a rova, even if there is no flesh on them, that the Nazir will lose out. Likewise, a spine, a skull, that don't amount to a rova. Alma kol shekain the spirulei l'rova de'echa de'ika rova atzamos mishedra v'gulgoles the Nazir megaleach Allah. And we're going to simply work with what Rashi says at face value, that if Rava is willing to say that a spine that for which there isn't a rova, a Nazir will lose out, then certainly if you have a rova of bones from a spine or a skull, the Nazir will lose out. So how can Rava be the one trying to conclude at the bottom of Nun Beis Amid Beis that for bones coming from a spine you would have to have a Chatzi Kav? It would seem from Rava's statement there that a Rova Kav would certainly be enough to force the Nazir to start all over again. How to continue reading this Gemara, let me tell you, is very, very controversial, or the subject of much discussion in the commentaries right here on the page of the Gemara. The Gra, for example, has a reading that says Aliba de Beis Shammai, or maybe it could be Aliba de Shammai, where the comment of Rava, which implies something of stringency, that would be in accordance with the teaching of Beis Shammai, who was stringent in their approach. But that's only Rava commenting according to Beis Shammai. But Rava's own opinion might be, like we tried to conclude at the bottom of the previous Amid Beis, that you would need a Chatzi Kav. The other approach is maintaining the text as it is, Boser Deshama Me Rabbi Akiva. In and of itself, that's a very difficult phrase to translate, because it would give you the impression that Rava said something, and he said something else after he heard it from Rabbi Akiva. Well, if you're talking about Rabbi Akiva in Mishnayos, so Rava knew all of the Mishnayos by heart. Tosfos suggests reading a totally different reading, and that it's not Rabbi Akiva, but rather Mar Ukva. That's one approach. The second approach in the Tosfos, and we've in our Mark Gemaras, you can see we've numbered them with Roman numerals 1 and 2. The second approach, taken by Rav Yankiv Mikinon, attempts to maintain the Girsa as it is. What we're going to do, just to deal with this particular phrase, Boser Deshama Rabbi Akiva, we're going to read the Rashi together. And Rashi appears on the second narrow line. We have a little star to help you find it. In Hachi Nami. It's true. Initially, Rava thought, or Rava's tradition had been, that a quarter kav of bones is enough. But then, when he heard Rabbi Akiva, who said spine and skull, and he didn't make any reference to a quarter kav of atzamos from a spine or skull, have amina l'Rebbi Akiva the afagav de mishnei meisim boyim ispehu tuma u'l'rabonan ad osi mimeis echad u'midelo tani hachi shma amina de l'kuli almo chatzi kav atzamos bo'inon. So, from the fact that the Mishnah was stated as it was, Rava himself understood that regardless of what kind of bones you're talking about, if you're not talking about a complete spine or a complete skull, but you're speaking about a collection of bones, whether the bones are from other limbs or from a skull or from a spine, you would have to have a half kav of atzamos. Let's continue in our Gemara. Third line from the top of Nun Gimel Amud Aleph. Toshma Shammai Oimer Etzem Echad Min Shedra O Min Golgailas. As far as Shammai is concerned, one piece of a spine, of one vertebrae from a spine, or one section of a skull, would be enough for the Nazir to lose out his Nazirus. What about the Chachomim? So we can conclude that the Chachomim would say that you'd have to have a rova of bones from the Shedra, showing us that the way we look at pieces of spine is more chomor, more stringent than the way we look at other bone pieces that are collected together. The Gemara says, no, don't conclude the opinion of the Chachomim as we just suggested. Shiny Shammai. Shammai is different than Machmir Tfei. He's exceptionally stringent. As far as the Chachamim are concerned, it would be a Chatzi Kav. Well, then Livshot Mino. Let us use this to conclude. Taimo de Shammai de Machmir. Shammai says one bone is because of their extreme severity, their extreme strictness. Oh, the Rabbanon, adiko chatzi kav atzomos. As far as the Rabbanon are concerned, regardless of what kind of bones they are, you would have to have a half a kav. And Tosfos explains, because if the Chachamim are going to be any more stringent than, we'll say, standard fare, and require a rova of spine or skull, then they would have had to spell that out also, just like Shammai spells out his stringency. The Rabbanan would have spelled out their stringency. Their stringency, of course, relative to the standard Chatzi Kav. They would reflect the stringency regarding the spine or skull bones, but they don't spell any stringency out. So, where does that leave us? That when it comes to all kinds of bones, you'd have to have a Chatzi Kav before a Nazir would lose out his previous counting. The Gemara rejects this. Dilmo ad kan lo pligi rabbanon le de Shammai elo be'etzem echad. It could be that, as far as the Chachamim's position, they argue with him with regard to a singular piece of vertebrae, of spine, mainly a vertebrae or a section of the skull. When it comes to a rova, quarter kav of bones from a spine or a skull, even the Rabbanan would agree that the Nazir loses out. And Tosfos explains, and they simply didn't bother spelling it out. In other words, in the first approach was to say that if the Rabbanan had a stringency, they would have spelled it out just like Shammai. Here we're saying not necessarily so. They might have had that stringency, then bother spelling it out. We continue in the Gemara. You'll notice there's a dashed frame section, and on the side we have a starred note. Tamlim is Geras HaMekufkav. The reason for this dashed frame, Ketazeh lo muvo kemokr tanoi. It's not brought as a Tanaic source. In Gemara markings, as I'm sure you all know, unless you're a first-time listener, sources that are Tanaic, that are cited in the Gemara, we put frames around them. This is not cited as a Tanaic source per se. Avokvisha muva behemshich humiatzeg shitas kedumos. As we go on in the Gemara, though, you'll see it represents early opinions. So therefore we treat it as if it's coming from the Tanaic literature. On the other side of the Gemara, our topic heading, we have written Deos. We will see opinions, B'chatzi, or Reva, Kavat Somos, or they have Chatzi versus Reva Lug Dam. Hashpalsam, what effects do these things have, these quantities of bones or quantities of blood, of course from corpses, what effects do they have al Truma, Kotshim, V'isapesel and Nazir, regarding a Kohen and his ability to eat Truma? Kohen has to be Tohar in order to eat Truma. What if he encounters these things? Kotshim, the ability to eat sacrificial meat. V'isapesel, someone on his way to do a Korban Pesach. One has to be Tohor in order to do a Korban Pesach. And in Nazir, a Nazir is expected to maintain purity, and if he becomes defiled, and we've seen this quite extensively to a certain degree, if he reaches a certain degree of defilement, he will lose his Nazirus. So now we have the Gemara. Omar Rebbe Eliezer, Zekenim Arishonim, the early sages, Miksosan Hoyu Omrim, Chatzi Kavat Somos, V'chatzi lug dam lakol, that a half kav of bones and a half lug of blood, corpse blood, lakol, means it affects all four areas. And they include Truma, Kotshim, Nazir, and Pesach, as we enumerated before. Rova atzomos, revius dam lo lakol. That means has no effect. It is not mitama. It doesn't have any effect on the items mentioned, on any of the 4 items mentioned. Umiksasan hoyu omrim, and some of the other early sages, because in Roman numeral 1, notice we mentioned miksasan. Some of them said, now have the others said, af rova atzamos uravias dam lakol. That those examples, 3 and 4, the rova atzamos and ravias dam, will affect all 4 areas: Truma, Kodshim, Nazir, and Pesach. Based in Shachreim Omru, a later court said, Chatzi kav atzamos v'chatzi lug dam lakol. Rova atzamos uravias dam l'truma v'kodshim. Avolo l'nazir v'oisa Pesach. So now this third opinion, take note, makes a distinction between Truma Kodshim versus Nazir and Oisa Pesach. The first 2 opinions did not cite any distinctions within those 4 categories. They did cite distinctions with regarding, we'll say, sources of defilement, but did not cite sources 1 and 2, or opinions 1 and 2, did not make distinctions between, we'll say, the subject of the defilement. Mifti. In looking at, we'll say, at these opinions, one, let's say, might have thought that the third opinion represents a type of compromise, maybe compromise is not the best word, but a method of settling the previous controversy. But we have a rule that says ein hachroas shlishis machras. That which represents a third opinion, and here it's clearly a third opinion, it's a third approach. The first 2 approaches made no chiluk between Truma Kodshim versus Nazir and Oisa Pesach. If one of the 2 earlier approaches had made a distinction, and then this third opinion comes along and chooses to follow one of those 2 previous opinions that had made the distinction, we would then say, let's follow this opinion, because he would favor one of the first 2 opinions. You have 2 against 1. But that's not what you have here. So should we follow Roman numeral number 3? So Omer Rav Yaakov Bar Idi, Mipi Shmua Amru, Mipi Chagai, Zechariah, Umalachi. This third opinion is not coming to, let's say, settle and weigh down one of the previous 2 opinions. They really are a third opinion, and they say their opinion as a result of an oral tradition that they have dating back to the end of the prophet period, the last prophets, Chagai, Zechar, Ma'achi. It's an oral tradition that this Roman numeral number 3 represents. With that, we conclude our shiur for today.
This was a presentation of the Daf Map. We hope you enjoyed it. Please like and subscribe to be informed of our other videos. For resources and more information, please visit our website at www.thedafmap.com.